Welcome to Unbox Your World, the podcast where philosophy meets tech. In each episode, we're connecting the dots between philosophy, technology, society, science, and progressive thought. And together with brilliant minds across the world who dare to challenge the way we think and live in today's society, we are unboxing our minds one episode at a time. I am Maria Salting. I am a tech professional during the day and a philosopher at night. So let's get started. Let's unbox ourselves. Welcome to the show. In today's episode, we have John Bunzl, who is a businessman and a political activist from the UK. And he has founded a new political initiative called the International Simultaneous Policy Organization, or simply Simpol for short. And today, climate change is globally known as a threat to humanity, but nevertheless, governments don't really seem to solve it. Now, you may think it is because they don't care, which in some cases might be true. But John argues that the core reason is in fact that governments lack the tools to truly solve it themselves. So he argues we need a new political solution and a system to solve global matters. What we need is a global vote for global issues to complement local and national governments. But we need to make sure that it is also designed in a way so that everyone is better off and that no country put their own competitiveness at risk. So he has designed a new global policy and a voting system where he actually applies a game theory and refers to something he calls the political prisoner's dilemma to understand the dynamics that make governments collaborate and to design a system where everyone is better off and so that it is aligned with everyone's motivations. The end result has ended up in Simpol, which is a new political solution to solve climate change. And the work is supported by many eminent professionals and researchers across the globe, such as José Ramos-Horta, who is a previous Nobel Peace Prize laureate. So in today's episode, you will learn more about what Simpol is, what it is that is refraining governments from cooperating across the globe, how you can design a system to solve global matters, and how evolutionary biology has in fact big problems for humanity in the past and what we can learn from it, and how the future of democracy can actually look like with an additional global vote to complement our existing voting systems. And some interesting facts about John is that the idea of Simpol actually came to him during a lunchtime conversation with his family in 1998. And since then, Simpol has been growing. Today, it is supported by over 100 members of the parliament in UK, and it is also growing internationally. Today, he is a retired businessman with 3 children and 3 grandchildren to date. And it makes me very hopeful that there are people like John out there who's trying to make an actual difference for the younger generation. And I look very much forward to sharing this episode with you all today. It has been very insightful and hopeful. We obviously need to work for it, but there are solutions to global problems. So let's get to it. So hello, John Bunzl, founder of Simpol. Welcome to the show.
There. Thank you, Maria. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you here, and I'm very excited to continue our conversation that we had the other week. So just to start off, then, so tell us your story, who you are, what is Simpol, and really how did you come up with the idea?
Well, I'm a retired businessman now. I'm 63 years old. I'm divorced. I have 3 children and 3 grandchildren. And I've worked in a family business all of my life, which is in raw materials trading internationally. And about the end of 1998, I was having a Sunday lunch with my family and my children. My mum was there, and the kids were talking about climate change because they were covering it at school. And after the meal, my mum turned round to me for some reason and just said, "Well, John, what would you do about climate change?" And yeah, nice question. And I just, it was something about the way she challenged me that I sort of went inside myself, and almost from nowhere, this really strong conviction arrived that it would have to happen simultaneously. Okay, because, and I think when I mean, it was completely, I really, it was like it came from nowhere. But when I think about it now, I think that may partly be because of my business background. So when you understand how international business and economics and capital flows are working, you understand that it's almost impossible for any country to significantly reduce its emissions unless other countries are doing the same thing. Because otherwise, to reduce emissions, you have to increase taxes and regulations. But any country that did that first in advance of other countries to any major degree would make its businesses, its economy uncompetitive with those elsewhere. And so I realized, I think I instinctively realized that this was a vicious circle. And the only way out of it is simultaneous action. So that's how the idea arrived. But I also realized that there was something much more profound to it, because the idea of, on the one hand, I was aware that we were all caught in this vicious circle. And that we if we didn't get out of it, we wouldn't survive. And of course, it's not just climate change that suffers from this problem. It's also nuclear weapons proliferation, it's tax avoidance, it's financial market regulation, there are wealth inequality. There are many, COVID is now another one. There are many global issues that suffer from this prisoner's dilemma kind of problem. But profound also in the sense that the idea of simultaneous action kind of creates a new cooperative context in our minds. Okay, and if we can talk internationally to one another about what we could do if we acted simultaneously, we have the opportunity. We create the opportunity to transit to a new world. Whereas if we don't have that image in our minds, if we don't have that context, if we don't create that context, we're just going to stay in the vicious circle, and we all know where that ends. So it was a very profound, very powerful moment of insight. And then since then, my first feeling was, well, if this is such a good idea, well, someone must have thought of it before, or maybe it's just a stupid idea. So I started reading and looking at, reading the newspapers. And the longer this went, the more I read, the more I discovered that actually nobody had really thought of it, at least not in this way. And that it was actually very relevant. And so I started to write my very first book, and I started to talk to people and talk about the idea, try to develop it into some kind of coherent, practical campaign rather than just an idea in my head. And it's gradually developed from there. And today we now have over 100 members of parliament in the UK Parliament who have pledged to implement the simultaneous policy. So Simpol is short for simultaneous policy. And we have members of parliament in the Irish Parliament, in the German Parliament, in the European Parliament, Australian Parliament, and Luxembourg, one or two other countries around the world. So, and citizen supporters as well in over about 150 countries. So it's beginning to develop now. But relatively speaking, we are still, we haven't broken through the media radar yet. But hopefully that'll change soon.
Yeah. So what is so then Simpol in a nutshell? If you do the elevator pitch for the listeners,
oh God,
what is it?
Okay, right. Well, there's really four aspects to Simpol. The first is simultaneous implementation. Okay, so this means that if all or sufficient nations implement an agreed set of policies at the same time, then you can break the vicious circle I was describing earlier. If everybody moves together, nobody loses out, everybody can win. Okay, so simultaneous implementation, that's the key first point. The second point is that it's a multi-issue framework. Okay, so if you look at, say, the way the United Nations today is trying to solve climate change at the COP, through the COP process, the next meeting is in Scotland, I think, later this year. They are dealing effectively with one single issue, carbon emissions. But if you take any single issue, there will always be some nations that win, others that lose. And of course, the losing nations have got no incentive to cooperate. Yeah. And so this is why, so there's no opportunity for trade-offs if you've only got one issue on the table. And so under Simpol, we are talking about a multi-issue policy package, if you like. So, for example, you would have a climate, an emissions reduction policy on the one side, but on the other side, you would have a global tax raising policy, perhaps something like a global currency transactions tax or a global wealth tax. And so the idea being that the billions that you raise from the tax, you can use to pay off the losers on the climate part of the agreement. And the whole point of that is that you then make immediate action in every nation's interests, at least in principle. Yeah. But right now, just dealing with one issue at a time, I sometimes think, how could I organize a global process for cooperation that has the maximum chance of failure? Well, it's what the UN is doing right now. And I think we're seeing that it's just not working because, yes, agreements are made like the Paris Climate Agreement, but it's just, and some progress is made, but it's all very incremental. We know that we need really big strides, not these little incremental strides. And you will only get that if you have simultaneous implementation, a multi-issue policy framework. The third aspect of Simpol is that the agreed policies that we would envisage would not be just targets. Okay. At the moment, again, at the COP process, they are talking about agreeing targets for emissions reductions. But the problem with that is that no nation knows exactly what every other nation is going to do to actually achieve those targets. And so the uncertainty remains about keeping their economies competitive, because if nation number one doesn't quite know what nation number 2, 3, 4, and 5 is going to actually do, nobody wants to move, So, this idea of just agreeing targets is just not transparent enough. And so that's the third aspect. But the fourth aspect, and the really exciting part about Simpol, this is a very long elevator, Maria, very high building, is the way that citizens can actually use their right to vote in a new way to drive, to incentivize politicians to agree a simultaneous policy. So effectively, what we invite citizens to do is when they sign on to the campaign, which is just simply filling in a form, it's basically saying that they will commit to giving strong preference at future national elections to politicians or parties who have pledged to implement the simultaneous policy. Okay, and the idea of that is it gives politicians an incentive to sign up to that commitment. And of course, once one politician or one party signs up, the competitors are forced to follow because they don't want to lose out. So as support for Simpol grows, we're becoming a kind of a growing voting bloc, if you like, which is capable of swinging elections or parliamentary seats one way or the other. And so, just to give you a very, very graphic example, I mean, I know in Sweden your political process is different, but in the UK, for example, we have one constituency, electoral areas, which just have one member of parliament, and so whoever wins the most votes gets the seat. And there are some areas in the UK where, in past elections, that seat has been won or lost by maybe just 100 votes or 150 votes or a very small number. And a number of times in past elections, this has happened where we managed to get one candidate to sign up in that area, maybe the Green Party candidate. And then we inform, of course, the competitor candidates from all the other parties. We inform them that this one candidate has signed up, the Green Party has signed up, and that, of course, our voters, our Simpol supporters in that area will be giving strong preference to whoever signs up. And then the next thing you know is then the Liberal Democrat signs up, and then the Labour Party guy signs up, and then the Conservative signs up. And so quite often we've had a case where we've had all the competing candidates have signed on to Simpol in advance of the election because, of course, they don't want to lose out, right? So this is a very powerful way that citizens can take back control and can actually make their votes count at the global level. Because again, if you come back now to the United Nations, for example, we citizens, we have no input into the United Nations or into these negotiations, none at all. And so if our politicians fail to cooperate at the global level, they have no price to pay. There is no punishment for them. There is no disincentive. With Simpol, that electoral power gives them the incentive, so that politicians who sign up gain the advantage of our preferential vote, but those who fail to sign up risk losing to those that have signed up. So it's a very powerful process. And we found also that it works not just in the UK, but in also proportional representation systems as well.
Such as Sweden?
Yes, I think in Sweden you have a more, do you have more of a party? Is it more, I mean, the candidates I think are more chosen by the parties? Or is that...
we don't have to,
okay.
Get into things. I don't know how to, but yeah.
I mean, I suppose you could say all democratic elections are based on party political competition. Okay, and so long as that's the case, Simpol should work, basically.
So all in all, to kind of summarize what Simpol is, then it's as I interpret it, it's essentially a way to vote for a global policy, and getting enough politicians to sign up for it, and it will be implemented in the future when and if enough people and politicians have signed up to it. So there's nothing to lose until that point in time.
That's right. And so because of that voting pressure that we apply, it also means that citizens have a strong influence on what the actual policy content of Simpol will be, right? So it's not a question of just applying pressure on politicians and then they decide what the policy should be. No, we citizens will have a strong input on what the policy content will be. So it's it's not a direct democracy, but it's going in that direction, you could say. And And also, I think the other way to look at it, Maria, is if you look at it from the point of view of a politician.
Mm.
For a politician looking at what we're doing, a politician would say to himself, well, I don't have anything to risk by signing up to Simpol, because it only gets implemented if and when all or sufficient nations have also signed up. So that's a plus. I also don't have to change my existing policies until that time happens. So that's another plus. I also get the benefit of the extra votes potentially that the Simpol voting bloc could offer me.
Yeah.
But if I don't sign up and my competitor signs up, I could lose my seat. I could lose the election. And so, it's from politicians' point of view, it also makes sense. And in fact, we have, of course, some politicians have signed up through the pressure I described, but many of them have signed up just because they think Simpol's a good idea. And they actually, they write to me and they say, well, thank you so much for at last there's a way of getting us out of this dilemma of this prisoner's dilemma that we're stuck in at the moment.
So, and that's, I mean, you're mentioning that on your website, that the Simpol is a way to understand root causes that keep governments from solving global problems. And I've seen that you've explained this in your TEDx talk in the form of what you're referring to, the political prisoners dilemma. So what is so how did you then design the Simpol solution to overcome these root causes that you're mentioning?
Yeah, well, I didn't really in the beginning, Maria, because the idea just came to me like that. Okay. But I suppose, yes, I did. We did in its articulation. We when we actually developed it into a campaign, we took into account all of this reading that I did and all of the issues where it was very obvious that there was this prisoner's dilemma dynamic going on. And so the two things just sort of worked together quite well, and it didn't take much development in a way. But our biggest problem really has been how to articulate it, how to explain it, because it's something, is it a world government? No. Is it an international treaty? Well, yes, but it's driven by citizens. We almost don't have a language for it. And that's why the elevator is, the building is the elevator pitch is quite long, because it's not something that has ever really happened before. And so it takes a little bit of explaining.
It's like a risk-free bet.
Yeah, in a way, yes. It's a win-win. It's a win-win at the global level, and we definitely need that, because it's I think people often think, governments are not solving climate change and these other problems because they're corrupt or they're stupid or they are being paid by vested interests. And yes, that can be the case, but much more relevant is the fact that it's not that they don't want to solve these problems, is that the vicious circle of what I call destructive global competition, this prisoner's dilemma that they're in, this fear of implementing anything that will risk their economies. That's what's stopping things. That's the real barrier. And it's not that people are evil, or generally speaking, it's not that people are evil. It's that they're just stuck, basically. They're stuck in this vicious circle.
Yeah. I mean, in Sweden, the environmental part, we talk a lot about proving that you can solve the climate crisis and still keep economic growth. But this is a more powerful, doing it together at the same time solution. I assume, instead of trying to do it alone in the world.
I think there is a lot of there's a lot of rubbish talked about. Well, we can stay competitive and solve these problems, but if that was really the case, we'd have solved them by now. If really you could have economic growth and profits and solve climate change, there would be no climate change. There would be no problem. Market forces would have solved the problem automatically. If those two things really were compatible. But the reality is that they are not compatible. There is, you've got to impose regulations and taxes if you want to stop people emitting carbon. And if you do that, any country that does that in advance of other countries is going to suffer a competitive disadvantage. It's just the way it is. And I think sometimes when people talk as if that wasn't the case, it's more like wishful thinking. Because, and I think often this is the case, I think, because the whole idea of global cooperation, most people think, my God, that's never going to happen. And then when some guy like me comes along and says, and what's more, it's got to be simultaneous, it's such a hard thing for people to kind of imagine as being possible, that they are then kind of confined to this wishful thinking that, maybe we can marry competitiveness with solving climate change, and they'll come up with all sorts of arguments, but it's just not the case, generally speaking. That's not to say that there aren't some certain technical solutions that might help, but the general rule, I think, is that there is a dilemma there.
Yeah. I think was it Einstein who said that we cannot solve the problems.
We can't solve present problems with the same thinking that created them. Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, that's absolutely right. And in a sense, you could say that the way of thinking that is most prevalent in the world today, or at least in the Western world, is what I call nation-centric thinking. So it's kind of enlightenment thinking, which is very either or. It's very linear. It's subtly rooted in the nation state. It's as if we look at the world through national glasses. Okay, so the competitiveness thing is a good example, actually, Maria, because if you say, well, doing this will make Sweden more competitive, that's a good thing, right? You looked at through national glasses, that's a good thing. But if you then see with world-centric glasses that action by Sweden will then cause a chain reaction, a vicious circle that causes all the other nations to do the same thing, maybe cutting its corporation tax or whatever the thing may be, you then see that actually that action that from a national perspective looked positive, from a global perspective, it looks negative. So it's a question of our worldview. Yeah.
And that is when last time we spoke about politics and the dynamics between countries. I said that I've often been thinking that if we could all become more aware and more understanding, that would be one of the keys to peace, because we wouldn't go into conflict. We would instead try to resolve the conflicts if we would understand each other better. But you then said to me that understanding is great, but it's not enough. So,
yeah. I mean, that's sort of what I meant, is that I think we've reached a stage now where the kind of political polarization that we see in almost every country now is not resolvable at the national level. It's just simply by understanding, someone who voted for Brexit will never understand someone who voted to remain.
Yeah.
And there is almost no way any amount of understanding, mutual understanding, will solve that problem. And the reason is because it's a question of worldview. People are at different, there are really different ways of looking at the world, and some are more sophisticated than others. And it's very difficult to get those different people who sit in those different worldviews to actually understand one another.
And you said also that even if they do, they would, still say that, well, I'm still worse off. So you need to design the system so that everyone is better off.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think what you're seeing today is that we've had 40 years of globalization ever since the 1980s. The Reagan Thatcher Big Bang of financial market deregulation, and that the freeing of capital to move globally has exacerbated this vicious circle I've been talking about of destructive global competition, because for every nation to prosper, it has to attract that capital. It's like a rain cloud that's moving around the world, but to grow, every country needs the rain to fall on its soil. And of course, to attract the rain cloud, they have to cut the regulations and make it more attractive and profitable for business to come to your country. And so the political effect of that has been that for citizens, it kind of doesn't matter who you vote for anymore, because whoever gets in, they've got to keep the country internationally competitive. Yeah. And as a result of that, parties on the left that traditionally supported the working classes by having fairly high taxes on the rich and redistributing to the poor couldn't do that anymore under the globalized environment, because that, of course, makes the country less competitive. And so what's happened is that left-wing parties, whether it's the Democrats in the USA or whether it's the Labour Party, and I'm sure it's similar in Scandinavia, they have gradually moved to the right. And they've kind of become business parties, And I think after 40 years of this now, particularly the working classes or people who feel on the losing end of globalization have just had enough. And that's why they're now voting Trump, Brexit, and for these populist far right or populist parties, because it's like a rebellion against a global economy that doesn't have the kind of global agreements you need that Simpol would provide, Yeah. And so it's this imbalance between a global economy on the one side, but only national governance on the other. And of course, you can't manage a global economy with governance that's smaller than global,
Yeah. So so you actually mentioned that an evolutionary biologist told you that Simpol solves these global problems the same way as evolution has solved big problems in the past. Who was that, by the way? And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's an evolutionary biologist. He's from Australia, a man called John Stewart. And he contacted me in about the year 2000.
Thank you
after he discovered Simpol. And he said this to me, just as you described.
You can go to
when I first heard it, I didn't know what he was talking about.
And also,
but when I looked into his work, which is really interesting,
never miss the latest episode. Thank you for today. See you in the next episode.
The whole of human evolution has been a series of steps where we've moved gradually to ever larger social units. So we've gone from, the families or tribes of prehistory, gradually to middle age, small states, then to larger nation states, and now we're looking at supranational organizations like the European Union, the United Nations, and so forth. But ultimately, where evolution is taking us is to some sort of global cooperative governance of the kind, something like Simpol. Mm. And what John Stewart is saying is that at each of those stages, there was a competition bottleneck. Mm. Okay, so for example, you might have two tribes that were warring against each other, and then suddenly a third tribe comes over the top of the hill, threatens them both, and they think, oh well, we better merge together to fight off this competitor. And so, in a sense, this competition drives cooperation on ever larger scales. That's the paradox.
So, cooperation. Yeah, so cooperation has been beneficial across evolution. Then.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So you could say that I think of them like a competition and cooperation as kind of dance partners. Mm. So most of the time, competition is leading the dance. Competition is the sort of default mode of life, if you like. Mm. But at a certain point, and that's what we're reaching now with globalization, competition becomes so frenetic and so destructive and so threatening to everybody that the pressure for cooperation starts to rise, and because everybody realizes, well, if we don't cooperate, we're finished, so which is the classic prisoner's dilemma. And so when I understood John Stewart's work, I could see how Simpol fitted into that evolutionary trajectory. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also really, really important, Maria, for people to understand these days, because I think when when your average person sees the world today and they see all this crazy stuff and climate change and this and COVID and God knows what else, it's scary. And I think only if you understand the evolutionary perspective, you can see that at each of these competition bottlenecks, this is exactly what happens. Mm. And so, yes, it's scary, but we can see where evolution wants to take us. And we can then work together to make sure that we get there. Mm. And Simpol, if you like, is simply a tool that we can use for doing that.
Mm. So, historically, humankind has proven to solve big problems when we have to.
Yes, well, we have, and you see, that's another really interesting thing, because a lot of people will say, but it's all too late. We'll never do it in time, and it's so unlikely that we could achieve global cooperation. It'll never happen. But if that was really the case, we wouldn't even be here now. Yeah. Because at each of these bottlenecks, the 90% probability was probably that we were finished, or that the tribe was finished, or the family was finished, or but we managed to leverage that 10% opportunity somehow, and if we hadn't have done that, we wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. That's it feels optimistic.
It feels optimistic, yeah. And I mean, I suppose my attitude is, well, the 90% probability is that we don't survive, but there's nothing I can do about that. The only thing I can do is to maximize the 10%.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's the kind of attitude we have to have. Mm.
So I think, just looking a bit broader. So what you are essentially doing is that you are innovating around new voting systems, and there are a few things happening around that space. And now, this is not the only innovation project going on around the voting. And then what we're almost seeing is a new kind of disruption industry taking place, which is politics tech. So how, since you are moving within this space, how do you imagine the future of democracy?
Well, I think as I sort of going back to what I said earlier, I think you will only save democracy at the national level if we add this new global level to it. Because without it, you will get what I described earlier. You get this situation where competition means that whoever gets in, whoever we elect, has to keep the country competitive. Then people get fed up with that, and then so the whole center ground of politics gets squashed out, and people move to the extremes. And then people say, well, democracy is useless, it's dying. But the real problem is that we haven't got the global level sorted out. If once we get the global level sorted out, we will find that nations are re-empowered so that they will be able to implement some of these solutions that today the world is crying out for, which they can't do today. And then I think democracy will be revitalized, but we will have added another layer to it. So for example, in the West, we're all very used to voting in local elections and in national elections, and sometimes in a state election in say, a country like India. And what Simpol does, it adds another layer at the global level. And I think when you do that, and if that works, the rest of the layers will become more healthy again.
Yeah.
So I think that's the overall. That would be my overall vision for the future of democracy. But I think unless we sort out the global level, none of these other gizmos and tech stuff is really going to work, because you're still going to have the vicious circle of destructive global competition still going to be carrying on.
Yeah. So then that the local politicians can focus on the local problems rather than the global ones.
Yes, that's right. It's it's no different to your body or mine. Different things are dealt with at different levels. Our individual cells are individual entities that are doing their thing, and so are the organs, and and so forth. It's what do you call it? Subsidiarity. But when the problem, like I said right now, is that the economy is global, but the governance is only national, and it's that imbalance, or the poison from that imbalance is trickling down the whole system, and it's degrading everything. It's degrading meaning making. It's degrading democracy. It's degrading almost everything that we care to look at. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think now with the pandemic today, we have a lot of people at the same time are rethinking how we live and our way of living, and also what are we optimizing for in our lives. Just recently I saw in the news that in fact 25% in Sweden are now considering moving out to the countryside house, which is a quite shift from the urbanization, and obviously that also has a ripple effect on how you rethink what we're optimizing for in society. And what do you and especially because we have more people are realizing that the short-term economic growth way of optimizing for more people understanding that it is destroying our planet. So, what would be an updated and more sustainable KPI in society to optimize for instead of GDP?
Okay. Yeah, I know. A lot of people are talking about gross national happiness and well-being indicators and things like that. And I mean, I think that's a good idea, but it's the way we optimize is not through indicators. It's through governance. It's through legislation. It's through laws, taxes, and incentives and disincentives. That's what shapes the values of an economy. So let me give you an example, Maria. Say, for example, that in Sweden, you said, okay, well, look, we're not going to do GDP anymore. We're going to have gross national happiness. Well, okay, but if you don't change the laws or you're still going to get, you're just going to get the same result. Or what you will find is that in order to keep your happiness going up, you will have to change the laws. So at the end of the day, these are just indicators. If you want to, you can't. The thing that instills values into an economy is governance. It's not anything else. If you want to have, say, not too much of a gap between rich and poor, well, you put in progressive taxes and the social safety nets. You can't just do it through an indicator. An indicator will maybe tell you, will point to what's happening, but it won't actually change. At the end of the day, you're still going to have to legislate. And my point is that the difficulty today is that governments can't do that because they fear becoming uncompetitive in many cases. And so again, if we want to make this shift towards gross national happiness or gross national well-being, we will need some kind of global cooperation to do that. So whichever way you dice or slice it, I think we will find that we will come back to the same conclusion.
So then essentially the laws that we have in society is a reflection of the kind of philosophy or the values that we have in society.
Yes, I think that's right. Exactly right, Maria. And that's right. And so it is those values that then inform the laws, which then shape the economy. Right. But the problem today is that those values are being degraded by destructive competition at the global level. So even if Sweden or Britain would have the value that we would like to cut our emissions, let's say, we can't do it because we're afraid of the consequences if other nations don't do it as well. So it's those values are being held back, I would say, by this vicious circle.
It kind of reminds me of, that when you have the corporate culture on nice words on the walls in the company, but nobody lives by them.
Yeah, well, I'm from the business world, and I always laugh because whenever I would visit a customer, you're sitting in their reception area and they've got this statement on their philosophy statement on the wall. The more pompous and grandiose the statement is, the more dominant that company is. That in other words, they're pretty much a monopoly anyhow, so they can say what they like, and it's just greenwashing most of the time.
So just the same as in corporations, that you actually walk the talk with those values, that the same kind of function the laws fill in society, you could say.
Sorry, say that again. I didn't quite.
So I mean, we talk about in a business context that you have to walk the talk with your values. So what you're actually doing is what is reflecting your true values, and the same way.
But there again, you've got the same problem, Maria. Because I'm sorry, I'm sounding like a broken record. I know, but as a businessman, I know the way this works. It's like you have your values, but competition with your, to stay competitive with your competitors, sometimes you're forced to compromise on those values. So for example, I don't know, say for example, you are losing market share and your costs are maybe too high. You're faced with a dilemma because to cut costs, you feel you have to cut maybe 100 jobs, let's say. And you're in the dilemma because you think, well, if I don't do that because it's against my values, I don't want to cut those jobs because that's against my values to throw these people out. The problem is that if I wait another 6 months, I might have to kick out 300 people. So it's like, as business people say, if we don't do it, our competitors will. So it's like if the Shell oil company doesn't exploit and pollute the Ogoni Delta in Nigeria, it knows damn well that Texaco or some other oil company will be only too happy to take its place. And business people, they've got to keep their share prices up. And so they're in a vicious circle as well. And I think we're fast reaching the point where, and in fact, I saw an article in The Economist a few years ago where it was about climate change, in fact, and it said it showed one of those old London telephone boxes gradually going underwater, and the headline was "Regulate us, please." This is where business people were basically saying to governments, you need to force, you need to legislate so that we know what the rules are to stop the climate change. But if you don't legislate, if you don't regulate us, we're stuck in, we're stuck in having to stay competitive with other companies and competitors that may be in other countries and all the rest of it. So, this similar kind of vicious circle applies in the business world as it does in the political world,
Which is why you need global governance around the global matters.
Yeah. And regulating business to some degree is a global issue as well. We need a sort of level playing field, and that doesn't mean. I mean, this is another point that's important, I think, about Simpol, is we're not talking about every nation implementing exactly the same policies. Rather, it would be that, for example, if you took corporation tax, for example, it's not a question that every nation would have the same level. It would more be that every nation agrees to increase its level relatively by a certain agreed percentage, let's say, so that every nation's relative competitiveness stays the same, but the amount of corporation tax that everybody raises is much higher. And then that can be used to fund. Yeah, exactly. So it's not Simpol is not a one size fits all straitjacket. It's rather more like it's like what we do in an individual country where the rich pay higher taxes than the poorer pay, but everybody pays them on the same date, so it's a similar principle, really.
So lastly, then, some future gazing. So 10 years from now, where do you see Simpol, and what is next on the agenda?
Well, 10 years. Well, I would hope that we will. It depends, I think. If the United Nations process is successful, and let's all hope that it is, then we can forget about Simpol, and I can go back to I can go on holiday, Maria. But if the United Nations process continues to fail, and the world's ability to deal with global problems continues to be inadequate, I think there's a good chance that Simpol will gradually become more and more widespread, will become better and better known. And it might hopefully at least offer us a lifeboat that we desperately need. But who knows? Who knows?
So then some last optimistic encouragement, if any of the listeners want to do what they can. What can they do?
Well, the first thing to do is to sign up to the campaign, which you can do at simpol.org, and it's completely free. But actually, we are looking for. We have nobody representing us in Sweden actually at the moment, and so if anybody likes this idea and would like to get involved, they can contact me, and we can discuss it and see what we can do. So yeah, I think there's everything to play for. There's everything to play for.
Nice. And then what's your email address if someone wants to reach out, or where should they?
Yeah, it's if you just email info@simpol.org is fine. Yeah. And if you go onto our website, there's lots of resources there. There's some animation videos and other things which you can use to spread the idea and to inform other people about it.
Yeah, the animation video is really good. It really explains well what you're doing. So
good. I'm glad you like it. Yeah.
To view that. Yeah.
Good.
So thank you so much for this has been a great conversation. Getting more and more enlightened about the health. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And if you want to read up more about the guest, then you can go to the show notes to get all of the links. And also, if you like this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter to never miss the latest episode. Thank you for today. See you in the next episode.